Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our reading of Meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply value your support. Please like and share this audiobook to reach a wider audience, allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ensuring you receive immediate notifications as we upload new content. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community of enlightenment and inner peace. Thank you for being part of our journey to make these profound teachings accessible to all. Let's start today with reading. Heightening the Mind. June 2001. The Buddha concluded one of his most important talks with the phrase, Adhisat Circa Ayogo, commitment to the heightened mind. What this means is that we lift the mind above its ordinary concerns, as when we come here to practice meditation. Our normal cares of the day, looking after our own bodies, feeding them, looking after other people, being concerned with what other people think about us, how we interact with them, all the concerns of the day, we put those down, lift our mind above them, and bring it to the meditation object. When you look at the affairs of the world, you see that they spin around just as the world does. There's a classic list of 8. Gain and loss, status and loss of status, praise and censure, pleasure and pain. These things keep trading places. You can't have the good ones without the bad ones. You can't have the bad ones without the good. They keep changing places like this, around and around, and if we allow our minds to get caught up in them, it's like getting our clothes caught up in the gears of a machine. They keep pulling us in, pulling us in. If we don't know how to disentangle ourselves, they keep pulling us in until they mangle our arms, mangle our legs, crush us to bits. In other words, if we allow these preoccupations to consume the mind gets mangled and doesn't have a chance to be its own self. We don't even know what the mind is like on its own, because all we know is the mind is a slave to these things, running around wherever they force it. So when we come to meditate, we have to learn to lift our mind above these things. All thoughts of past and future we put aside. We just bring the mind to the breath, so the mind doesn't have to spin around anymore. It simply stays with the breath coming in, going out, and gains at least some measure of freedom. From this heightened perspective, we can look at our normal involvement with the world and begin to realize that, for the most part, it doesn't go anywhere. It just keeps spinning around, coming back to the same old places over and over and over again. All that gets accomplished is that the mind gets more and more worn out. If we allow the mind to rise above these things so that it doesn't feed on them, doesn't run after them, we'll begin to get some sense of the mind's worth, in and of itself. As the mind gets still, things begin to settle out. Like sediment in a glass of water. If you allow the water to stay still for a time, whatever sediment is in there finally settles out, and the water becomes clear. This is what happens when you let the mind separate from its ordinary concerns, and simply stay with its meditation. Even when you go back into your normal activities, you'll have a sense of the mind, your awareness, as something separate. This sense of separate is a very important part of the practice. It's part of the day-to-day work of practicing the Dhamma. We all come to the practice hoping that someday some really great experiences are going to hit us while we're meditating. Well, they're not going to hit unless you do the day-to-day practice. This is why the Buddha insisted that there are 4 noble truths, not just the truth of the cessation of suffering, but also the tasks of understanding suffering, abandoning its cause, and developing the path. These are all very important parts of the teaching. They're all noble truths. The development of the path is largely 2 things. 1. Developing qualities that enhance the mind's ability to know, to be aware. And then, 2. Learning how to let go of things that are burdensome to the mind. This is what it means to heighten the mind. Once you let go of the burdens, the mind gets lighter and begins to rise above things. Learning how to do this in all activities is very important, because when the really technicolor experiences hit in the meditation, if you can't rise above them, you're just going to fall for them, too. And they eventually lead you back into the world again. Your attachments lead you back. So a large part of the practice is learning how to lift your mind, stage by stage. You lift it above your ordinary everyday activities, and you get into a good state of concentration. In the beginning, the mind and the object seem to become one when you're really absorbed. But as you allow the mind to stay in that state for a while, it begins to separate out as well. You begin to see the object as one thing, your awareness as something else, and although they're right next to each other, they are separate things. This is what enables the mind to gain insight both into the workings of the mind and into the workings of its objects. It also develops the habit of learning how to let go, stage by stage. You rise from one level of concentration to the next. You pull back. The image in the texts is of a person sitting up looking at a person lying down, or a person standing looking at a person sitting. You pull back bit by bit, stage by stage. No matter how good the stage, you begin to realize you've got to lift above it. This is especially important when really strong experiences come in the meditation. You don't jump to any conclusions. Again, you lift the mind above them and watch. Hopefully by that time the habit has become built-in enough so that you realize you can't allow yourself to get attached to anything, even the really amazing experiences. Lift yourself up rung by rung along the ladder. You go from one attachment to a higher one. Finally, though, there comes a point where you have to let go and just watch what happens. Only when you've developed this habit of lifting the mind up can you get through some of these experiences that waylay everyone else along the meditation path. We're not just here for the experiences. We're learning the basic skills we need so that no matter what experience comes to the mind, we don't fall for it. We don't latch onto it so that we don't become a slave to it, for the whole purpose of the practice is freedom, and yet the habits of the mind tend towards self-enslavement. Even when great feelings of oneness or unity or unlimitedness come into the mind, you find on a very subtle level that the mind can become enslaved to them as well. And the question is how, instead of becoming enslaved or enthralled, you can learn even from that kind of experience. Ultimately, the mind has to become totally free, even from the state of oneness, even from the state of unlimitedness, because a lot of those experiences are just states of concentration. There's still a subtle level of attachment and conditioning going on. But if you develop the habit of learning how to let go and rise above things even while you live in the midst of them, then you've developed the proper habits, the skills you need that are going to protect you in all circumstances. There's a fine passage in one of Ajahn Mahabua's talks where, at the time of Ajahn Mun's death, he sits and reflects. At first he feels lost. Here is the teacher he was able to depend on for so long, and now that teacher is gone. What is he going to do? After a while he begins to realize. Well, what were the things he taught when he was alive? Take those as your teachers. And one constant theme was, whatever arises in the mind, if you don't get caught up with it, but just stay with that sense of knowing, with the knowing as separate from the event in the mind, then, no matter what, that experience will pose no dangers for you. This skill of learning how to step back, raise the mind above its experiences. This is what's truly distinctive about the Buddha's teachings. This is what's distinctive about his approach to the really spectacular, non-dual experiences in the mind. If you haven't learned how to develop that approach to ordinary experiences in the mind, looking for the use of the experiences, rather than trying to feed on them, then the spectacular ones are going to eat you up whole. This is why the habits developed along the path are so important. This is why the path is one of the Four Noble Truths, on a par with the others. So keep this teaching in mind, this issue of the heightened mind. Watch out for when you allow the mind to lie beneath its objects, under the power of its objects, and when you're able to lift it up above them, so that even though you live with them, you have a sense of rising above them, of being able to use them, of not being caught up in them. That's the skill we're working on. Respect for concentration. July 2001. We just chanted about having respect for concentration. This is an important principle to keep in mind because all too often the stillness of our minds is something we step on. An idea pops into our heads and we go running after it. We leave our home base very quickly and then find it hard to get back. We've got to learn how to make concentration our normal state of mind. Centered, present, alert to the body, alert to things going on. It's not that you don't sense other things when you're concentrated, or that you don't register them with your senses at all. Simply that the mind doesn't move out after them. The mind stays firmly based in the breath, its home base, and from there it protects that sense of being centered, looks after it, maintains it. This is the only way that concentration can grow, can develop the real stability we need to withstand whatever comes up. Too many times I've heard people say, now that my mind is calm, what do I do next? They're in a great hurry to jump to the next step, to run off into insight. But before the mind can gain any liberating insight, it has to overcome its impatience to move. You need to get it very solid, very secure, because when you start working on the issues of insight, trying to understand why greed, anger, and delusion take over the mind, you're going to find yourself running up against all kinds of storms. If your concentration isn't really solid and settled, you'll just get blown away. So you have to respect this part of the path. After all, it's the heart of the path. The Buddha once said that right concentration forms the heart of the Noble Eightfold Path, while all the other factors of the path are simply requisites, supports for the right concentration, to keep it right, to keep it on track. So have some respect for this quality of mind. Look after it. Sometimes it seems like we're going against the Buddha's teachings on inconstancy, stress, and not self, when we focus on putting the mind in a state that's constant, easeful, and ours. We get really absorbed in this sense of oneness, and we come to identify with it, both with the stillness and with the object of the stillness as well. It all becomes one. So it seems like we're running counter to what insight is supposed to tell us. But what we're actually doing is testing the limits of human effort. We're taking the khandhas, these aggregates of body, feeling, perception, thought fabrications, and consciousness, and instead of identifying with them, we use them as tools. And as part of the process of mastering them as tools, there will have to be a sense of identification. You identify with the state of concentration, whatever sense of the body is present in the concentration, whatever feelings, perceptions, thought fabrications, and consciousness are there. That's why you become so devoted to them. They all turn into a oneness. But instead of simply identifying with them, you're also treating them as the path. That makes all the difference. You bring things together, and, once they're brought together, you can sort them out for what they are. If everything is scattered all over the place, it's hard to see how things interact. It's hard to see where the connections are, and where the lines are drawn between them. But when you get them all right here, gathered into one, then once they've been staying together for a long while, they begin to separate out. Ajahn Lee has a nice image of taking a rock and putting it in a fire. When the various elements in the rock reach their melting point, they melt out of the rock, one at a time. That's how they separate. The same holds true with all the things you're going to try to understand and gain insight into. Once they've been together a long period of time, gathered here in a sense of oneness, they begin to separate out. And all you have to do is ask the question, what's this? Is this the same as that? And then you just watch. You begin to see that there's a natural dividing line between these things. But until you've brought the mind to oneness in concentration, you can't really see that. All the dividing lines you see are the ones imposed by words and ideas, by preconceived notions. Put those preconceived notions aside and just focus on getting the mind centered. You're sitting here in concentration, trying to get the concentration as refined and as solid as possible. When you get up to leave, don't drop it. Try to maintain it. An image they use in the canon is of a person carrying a bowl on his head, filled to the brim with oil. Try to develop that same sense of balance, care, and mindfulness. As you get up from concentration and go to wherever you're spending the night, try to maintain that sense of being centered and poised. Don't let it spill. This is one aspect of having respect for concentration. Trying to maintain it throughout the course of the day, not letting yourself get distracted outside. Again, You'll be aware of outside things. People to talk to, work to be done, the sounds of the birds, the wind in the trees. These things will all be present to your awareness, but you won't send your attention out after them. Try to keep your center here inside. As you develop this continuity, it becomes your habitual center of awareness, your habitual point of reference. The movement of other things in relation to that center becomes very clear. In other words, the impulse to go out and see something. You'll see it exactly as that a current or a physical sensation in certain parts of the body that runs or flows out after things. If you can catch sight of it, you'll see. Oh, that's what happens when the mind focuses its attention outside. There's both a mental and a physical side to that change of reference. When your sense of clear awareness is still enough, you can see these things as they move. The more still your frame of reference, the more refined the movements you can notice in the mind. So this element of stillness is very important. Without it, insight is just words, ideas, things you picked up from books. But with it, insight is seeing things as they actually happen, as they actually move. So this is the basis from which insight comes, the insight that leads to release. You begin to observe the movements you used to ride on, because now you're not riding on them anymore. You see these movements of the mind as they flash out, but you don't go flashing with them. That's what makes all the difference. If you ride out with them, that's just the way of the normal mind. But if there's a sense of being centered inside, you can see the movements of the mind as they go out, as thoughts go out, as perceptions go out, latching onto things. You see them as they actually happen. You begin to wonder, why would I ever want to identify with that? That's when the possibility of release comes. But this can happen only when you're really, really still. And to be still you'll need a sense of well-being here in the present moment. Otherwise, the mind won't stay. For the concentration to stay solid and unforced, you want to feel good being right here. You work with the breath in whatever way will help you to settle down, to stay clear and centered. As you use the breath to work through pain in the body, you'll find that some pains you can deal with and some pains you can't, but the only way you'll know is by experimenting. If there are pains you can't disperse by adjusting the breath, you learn to live with them. You learn not to identify with them. You're aware of them, but there's a sense of separation between the sense of awareness and the pain. That makes it bearable. If you're going to identify with certain parts of the body, identify with the good ones. Find the parts of the body where you can maintain a sense of well-being through the breathing. Focus on those. Those become your center, your point of reference in the midst of this moving world. The uses of pleasure and pain. August 2001. Allow your awareness to settle in on the breath and get aligned with the body. It takes a little experimenting to find exactly what amount of pressure is needed, what amount of force is needed to stay with the breath and the body in a way that's just right. If the pressure is too light, the mind goes drifting off. If it's too heavy, the body starts feeling constricted, the mind starts feeling constricted, and it's going to look for a way to get out. So try to see precisely what amount of mindfulness and alertness is needed just to keep the body and mind together right at the breath. The breath will be a good barometer to let you know when the pressure is too much, when it's too little, but you've got to know how to read the barometer. This is why we practice meditation day after day after day, to get more familiar with our barometer. To begin with, you can focus your awareness at any one spot in the body where the sensation of breathing is very clear. It might be the tip of the nose, the throat, the middle of the chest, the abdomen, any spot where you know clearly. Now the breath is coming in, now the breath is going out. There's a sense of rightness about the spot. It's an easy spot to maintain your focus. This may seem strange, this emphasis on ease and comfort in the meditation, after everything we've heard about the Buddha's teachings on pain, stress, and suffering. But you have to look carefully at what he says about pain, stress, and suffering, and also what he has to say about pleasure. Look at the Four Noble Truths. Truth number 1, of course, is stress and suffering. But buried down in number 4, the path, you find the most important factor of the path, right concentration, which involves getting the mind focused on the breath with a sense of ease and rapture. This rapture comes from seclusion. Seclusion here meaning that you're not thinking about past, not thinking about the future, you're right here with the present moment. Things are settling in, and there's a snugness to how things feel. It feels good, it feels secure, being right here. Look at what the Buddha has to say about the tasks with regard to each of the noble truths. The task with regard to stress and suffering is to comprehend it. The task with regard to the path is to develop it, which means you want to develop that sense of ease, the sense of rapture that comes as the mind begins to settle down in concentration. What you're doing is taking one of the aggregates, the aggregative feeling, and instead of latching onto it or pushing it away, you learn how to use it as a tool. When pain and stress and suffering come, you want to comprehend them. Comprehending pain and stress teaches you a lot about the mind. The Buddha never said that life is suffering. He just said there's suffering in life, which is a very different teaching. As long as there's going to be pain, as long as there's going to be suffering, get the most use out of them. You find as you focus on pain, as you get to know it, get to comprehend it, that you learn all kinds of things about how the mind is working. In particular, you learn to see what it's doing to take a physical pain and turn it into mental pain, or, if you're starting with mental pain, to make it worse. But to watch that feeling of pain long enough and consistently enough so that you can comprehend it, the mind needs strength, it needs nourishment. Otherwise it gets drained. That's where the pleasure in the path comes in. That's your nourishment. Try to create a sense of well-being in the mind as it's focused in the present moment, so that it doesn't feel threatened by the pain, doesn't feel drained by the pain, so that you always have a place to go when you need that strength. What we're doing is taking one of the aggregates that we usually cling to. Clinging here doesn't mean just holding on. It also means trying to push away, and pushing away is like pushing away a glob of tar. The more you push it away, the more you get stuck. So instead of clinging or pushing away, we try to learn how to use these aggregates as tools, in the same way you'd use tar to make asphalt for paving a road. This is a common theme running throughout the Buddha's teachings. Before you can let go of anything, you have to learn how to master it. Otherwise, you're just holding on, pushing away, holding on, pushing away. And nothing comes from that except more stress, more suffering, more pain. This harms not only you but also the people around you. If you're constantly feeling worn down by the pains and the inconveniences of life, you'll find it hard to be kind to other people. In fact, most of the evil things people do in their lives come from their sense of being totally overwhelmed, feeling weak and trapped, and then lashing out. But if you give the mind the sense of strength and security that comes with knowing it has a center it can return to and gain nourishment from, it's a gift not only to yourself, but also to the people around you. It's not a selfish practice. Learn how not to hold on to feelings, grabbing hold of the pleasant ones, pushing the painful ones away. Instead, learn how to use them as tools. When they're used as tools, they open things up in the mind. You understand where the mind is unskillful in how it manages its thinking, and you realize that you don't have to be unskillful. There are better ways to think, better ways to manage the thought processes in the mind. And a funny thing happens. As you master these processes, they bring you to a point where everything reaches equilibrium. That's where you can really let go. You can even let go of your tools at that point because they've taken you where you want to go. From that point on, everything opens up to the deathless. But you can't get there by pushing and pulling your way around. If the deathless were something you could force your way into, everybody would have gone to Nibbana a long time ago. It requires a lot of finesse, a lot of skill in how you deal with the mind, learning to recognize the time for analyzing issues of stress and suffering, and the time for letting the mind rest, so that it can gain strength and then go back to work. The ultimate skill is learning how to put those two things together. In other words, you develop states of concentration to give the mind a really solid center, and from that center, you can begin to let go of things that are obviously unskillful, things you obviously don't want to hang on to. Then when you've let go of everything else, you turn on that pleasant center you've been developing and take it apart. But all too often we've read the books that tell us what comes next in the practice, and we want to get on to insight as fast as possible. In doing so, we tend to destroy the very quality that's going to help us. This ability to get the mind aligned with the body in a way that feels just right, and then to use the strength, use the nourishment that comes from that, the stillness and ease, the steadiness that comes from that. Only then can you really gain insight. In other words, you just can't jump over concentration or go rushing through the various levels. It's something you want to settle down into, so that you can stay still, calm, for long periods of time. And when you can stay that way during your formal sitting, you take it out and try to maintain that same calm center, no matter where you go, no matter what happens. That's when you really gain interesting insights into the mind, seeing how it goes flowing out after things, rushing to grab hold of this, rushing to push that away. The Buddha talks about effluence in the mind, things flowing out of the mind, and when you can maintain your center you actually get a physical sense of the energy flowing out, as the mind loses its alignment with the body and goes out after its objects. The trick is learning how to maintain that still, steady observer, so that you can see the movement and realize you don't have to go along with it. The movement is something separate. The knower is something separate. And the movement dies away. When you have that separation clearly delineated, you can see even more clearly which of the mind's actions are skillful and which are not. You begin to see cause and effect in a way that really opens things up in the mind. So we carry these 5 khandhas, these aggregates, around with us, and the wisdom of the Buddha is in taking these aggregates that tend to weigh us down, like big lumps of metal in a suitcase, and opening up the suitcase to look inside. That's when you begin to see that they're not just lumps of metal. They're tools that you can apply to dismantling your attachment so you don't have to lug things around anymore. Use them to cut away your obvious attachments, and then finally, when everything else is taken care of, you can let go of your attachments to the tools themselves. But until that point, you want to take good care of them, not to the point of worshipping them, but careful enough that they stay in good shape, so you can actually use them. This is why the Buddha didn't teach self-torment, but he didn't teach self-indulgence, either. The middle path between the two is not half indulgence and half torment. It's learning how to regard these aggregates as tools. You've got aggregates of form, feeling, perception, thought fabrications, and consciousness. Learn how to treat them as tools, showing them the proper care and attention that tools need, but also realizing that they're not the be-all and end-all of life. They're processes, not things. They've got their uses, but they're not ends in and of themselves. Once you've got that point clear, the path opens up. An Introduction to Pain. March, 2002. So many people accuse the Buddha of being pessimistic. He starts his teachings with pain. And yet when you first sit and meditate, what do you find after the first 5 or 10 minutes? Pain. You can't avoid it. Or when people just can't sit by themselves, can't spend a whole day by themselves without busying themselves with this, that, or the other thing, what's the problem? It's mental pain, mental discomfort. These are things we live with all the time, and yet we think somehow that if people point them out, they're being pessimistic. Of course, the Buddha's purpose in pointing out pain and suffering wasn't just to stop right there, pointing them out and saying, "Isn't that horrible?" He says, "Look, there's a solution." In fact, his approach to pain is extremely optimistic. Human beings can put an end to suffering, in this lifetime, through their own efforts. So when we sit here, we have to anticipate that there will be pain in sitting still. The reason we normally move around is because we encounter pain in a particular posture, so we change a little bit to get away from it. The Buddha's approach isn't to try to run away from it that way. He says, look into it. As Ajahn Suwat used to say, we normally take our cravings as our friends and our pains as our enemies. We should switch that around. Learn to look at pain as your friend and craving as your enemy. The craving is what's really causing all the problems. The pain is just there to teach you something. Of course, it's a difficult friend. Some people are easy to be friends with, you can get along with them with no problem at all. Others are difficult. Pain is definitely a difficult friend, but one worth cultivating. Still, because it's difficult, you have to go about it the right way. This is why, when we start meditating, the Buddha doesn't have us focus immediately on the pain. He says to focus on the breath instead, because whatever pain is associated with the breath and it tends to be subtle, but it is there as something you can manage, something you can deal with. He gives you the breath as your tool for dealing with the pain. So when you're aware of pain, don't yet let your primary focus be on the pain. Keep your focus on the breath. In other words, get used to being acquainted with the breath first, because that's the person who'll introduce you to pain properly. It's like meeting any important person. You first have to get to know certain well-connected friends who can introduce you to that person. And that's the way it is with pain. You have to know the breath first, for it's your well-connected friend. So get in touch with the breath. Find a place in the body that's relatively at ease, relatively comfortable, and focus there first. Get to know that spot first. Be very sensitive to the breathing at that spot. When you breathe in there, how does it feel? When you breathe out there, how does it feel? Is there even the slightest discomfort? Can you make it feel better? Can you experiment with different ways of breathing, different ways of conceiving the breath energy in your body? When you find something that feels really good, the whole tone of your body will feel really good. Instead of sitting here tensely trying to breathe in one spot, think of the whole body relaxing into the breath. The more relaxed you are about the practice, the longer you'll be able to stay with it. So think of yourself as just relaxing into the body, relaxing into the breath. Find a way of breathing that feels really good all the way from the beginning to the end as it goes in, and all the way from the beginning to the end as it goes out. Make that your foundation. Once that feels good, think of spreading that good breath energy to the other parts of the body. Think of it as going right through the pain. Many times a lot of the discomfort we feel around pain comes from tensing up around it, and the tensing up just makes things worse. So try to breathe through any tension you feel. Breathe right through the pain, all the way on out. Suppose there's a pain in your hip or in your knee. Think of the breath going through the hip, through the knee, all the way out through the toes as you breathe in, and out into the air as you breathe out. As you approach the pain, try to maintain the same mental tone and feeling tone you had when focusing on the comfortable breath. Your primary frame of reference here should still be the breath. There's no way you're not going to notice the pain, but ask yourself, how does the breath affect the pain? How does the pain affect the breath? Always keep the breath in mind as your frame of reference. That gives you a handle on the pain. Otherwise, if you jump right into the pain, you find yourself picking up the energy from the pain that puts you on edge. The first thing you'll think will be, make the pain go away. And then there's even more impatience as you get involved in the past and the future of the pain. But when you stay with the breath, you want to be as much with the present as possible. Don't think about how long the pain has been there or how long it's going to stay. Just, what's there right now? That takes one huge burden off the mind right there. So as you go through the pain, make the thread of your awareness stay with the breath. That's what you want to keep track of, that's what you want to hold on to. Learn to relate to the pain through the breath, rather than just butting up against the pain head-on. Now, if you find that the pain just gets worse and worse and worse to the point where you can't stand it, sit with it another 5 minutes, and then change your position. In other words, push your limits a bit at a time, and you'll find that you get better and better at staying with the pain, more skillful in maintaining your frame of reference with the breath. As long as you really stay with the breath, you'll be okay. Slipping away from the breath is what creates the problems, because the mind then immediately creates stories about the pain, creates issues around the pain. Why is this pain happening to me? Or if it's a physical pain that you know you caused, why did I do that? All these questions: how much longer is it going to last? Am I going to have this pain the rest of my life? Just drop them right now. Stay with the breath. Deal immediately in the Present, because the past and the future are not actually there. They are things the mind creates, and once they're created they turn around and bite the mind. So try to stay with that thread of the breath as it goes through the pain. Then you'll begin to see why the Buddha focused on pain as the primary spiritual issue in our practice, for it teaches you so much about the mind. It's like filming a documentary on the animals in the desert. If you go out and spend the day wandering around the desert, you'll probably miss most of the animals. But if you set up your camera at a safe place near the waterhole 24 hours a day, all of the animals in the area are going to have to come there. That's where you get to film them all. It's the same with the pain. If you focus steadily on the pain, you'll see all the mind's reactions around the pain. All its issues will come to the surface and congregate there. At the same time, if you use the breath as your tool for dealing with the pain, those issues won't totally overwhelm you. It's like having a safe shelter to run to. If the lion's object to being filmed, you've got a safe place in the breath. You're not totally at the mercy of the pain. You can pull out any time you want, and you've got a handle to deal with it. You've established a feeling tone around the whole body that holds the pain, not grasping onto it, but surrounding it with an energy, surrounding it with a space where you're not threatened by it. Then you can deal with it. When you're not threatened, you can really get into the present moment. If you find that you can't yet handle it, you've got the breath to go back to. But when things get stable enough in the mind, clear enough in the mind so that you can handle it, then you really can start looking at the pain as your friend. You can get familiar enough with it, so that ultimately you can understand it for what it truly is, so that ultimately it's no longer a problem. Until that point, it's always going to be a difficult friend, but if you start off on the right foot, using the breath as the basis of your friendship, you'll find that you're in a good position to make the friendship work. A Dependable Mind. November 10, 1996. Our basic problem in life is that the most important thing in our lives is the thing we know the least about. Our own minds. As the Buddha said, all things come out of the mind. All our experiences, all the happiness and all the pain we experience, come from the mind. All things have the mind as their forerunner. Things are made of the mind, determined by the mind, and yet we don't know our minds, so our lives are out of control. We don't understand where things come from or how things happen in our lives. That's why we have to meditate to get to know our own minds. The difficulty in meditation is that you can't focus directly on the mind. It's like focusing on the wind up in a sky with no clouds. You have no way of knowing which direction it's going, because there's nothing against which it's going to make contact. That's why you need a meditation object like the breath or Buddha or parts of the body. Whichever object you find easy to settle down with, that's the one you take. Having an object gives the mind something to bounce off of, because when you decide you're going to stay with something, you begin to see how erratic the mind is. It keeps jumping around. It goes here a little while, then it goes there for a little while, and then over there. You begin to realize how this most important element in life, the mind, is so totally out of control, totally undependable. That's why the mind needs training. We need to strap it down to one object and make it stay there, so that we can really get to know it and train it until we sense that we can depend on it. We talk about taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, but they can be our refuge only when we bring them into the mind. And the mind can be dependable only when we've got the qualities of the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha in there. Qualities like mindfulness, concentration, persistence, and dependability. So if you want to depend on the mind, make it something you can depend on. The Buddha's good news is that it's possible to do this. At the time the Buddha was teaching, there were other teachers who said that there is nothing that you can do about the way life is, it's all written in the stars. Others said that no matter what we do, any action leads to more suffering, so the only way to stop suffering is to stop acting. And still others said that life is totally chaotic, there's no way you can make any sense out of it at all, so don't try. Just try to have as much fun as you can while you can, because everything falls apart at death. So, there were all kinds of teachings, but they were all teachings lacking in hope. The Buddha's teaching was the only one that offered any hope. He said, yes, there is a skill that you can develop in training the mind, and, yes, it does lead to true happiness. So just as with developing any skill, you have to be observant, stick with it, be sensitive to what you're doing, be sensitive to the results, make necessary changes or adjustments, and, as a result, you keep getting better and better and better at it. Sometimes the improvement is hard to see because it's so incremental. It takes such tiny steps, but you can rest assured that whatever positive energy you put into the practice is going to produce positive results. That's also part of the good news of the Buddha's teachings. Nothing good you do is wasted. No effort that you put into right effort is wasted. So we have conviction in the Buddha's teaching because he teaches us to have conviction in ourselves that the practice is something we can do. We don't have to depend on anything from the outside at all. Your own power, your own potential. That's what's going to get you where you want to go. If you have to depend on others, you don't really know if you can depend on them or not. Will they be there when you need them? They might change their minds. After all, you have no control over things outside of you. Even though you currently may not have much control over the mind, you can still work at it and develop more and more control over time. Tell the mind to sit down and stay in one place often enough, and eventually it will stay. It's going to rebel for a while, but if you use your ingenuity in teaching it, showing it that in being obedient this way it won't always have to be struggling or suffering, it's going to find that it actually likes settling down. And then you can hardly keep it from settling down. It wants to keep coming back to the state of stillness, feeling at home in the present moment. This is why we adjust the breath in the practice, to help the mind settle down easily. And we work to get to know the breath. What are the different ways it has of coming in? What are the different ways it has of going out? How does it affect the rest of the body? When the breath comes in and out, it's not just the air coming in and out of the lungs. It's the energy that courses through the whole body, throughout every nerve. Think about the whole nervous system going down from the brain, down the backbone, out the arms, out the legs, encompassing all the parts of the body. Then allow yourself to think that the entire system can be affected by the breath. If you let it happen, let the whole body relax and get into the breathing. Let your mind get into the breathing. Don't think of yourself as being outside someplace looking at the breath. Be immersed in the process of breathing. The whole body breathes in. The whole body breathes out. And you're right in there with it. After you work at this for a while, you begin to find that the work pays off. It really feels good, feels gratifying, just to sit here breathing. The mind has a sense of being at home. If the mind were to go out to think of other things, you'd be sending it out into a territory it totally has to create for itself. But you don't have to create much right here in the present moment. When you're really with the breath, you're putting much less of a strain on the mind. And when the mind gets used to this, it decides that it really likes it. Until it decides that it likes it, you have to use both the carrot and the stick. The carrot is the comfortable sensation of breathing. The stick is the constant reminder of what's going to happen if the mind doesn't come under control, if it isn't willing to settle down all the suffering and pain that you'll have to endure. The Buddha said that when people suffer, when there's pain in life, they have two kinds of reactions. One is bewilderment because they don't know where the pain comes from or why it's happening. The second reaction is the desire to get free of the pain one way or another. And these two reactions go hand in hand. You're bewildered at the same time that you're trying to get free, and so you tend to do all kinds of unskillful things to get away from the pain, things that aren't helpful at all. But through practice you come to realize that the pain in the body isn't the culprit. The pain in the mind, the mental anguish, the mental distress, that's the real problem. When you really get to know the mind, you see that the pain in the body isn't such a big deal at all. It becomes a problem only when the mind takes it on and converts it into mental pain. But to understand mental pain, you have to work with physical pain. So after the mind has settled down, focus it on the pain. Pain in the legs, pain in the back, whatever. Just get to know it as it's actually present. What is this? Pain? Is it what you think it is? Try to see the pain on its own simply as a sensation, and not as a pain without all the presuppositions you may have about it. That it's placed right here, that it has this shape, that it's taken over the body, or whatever crazy notion the mind has about the pain. When you think about it, most of the notions you've developed about pain were developed when you were really small, because that's when you first met up with pain. The first thing they do when you're born is to spank you so you can breathe. And even before they spank you, going through the process of birth is enough to make you pass out. So we've been dealing with pain ever since we were small, and for most of us the strategies we've been using are those we picked up when we were so small that we didn't know what was going on. A lot of those strategies are still there in your mind. So just sit down and get to know the pain. Simply regarding the pain as something you want to know changes a lot of your subconscious attitudes toward it right there. Your usual attitude is that once there's pain, you want to get rid of it, to get away from it. Of course, if you keep running away from it, you're never going to get to know it, you'll never get to understand it, and this means that you'll end up dealing with pain more and more out of bewilderment. So once the mind has settled down in the sense of well-being fostered by the breath, tell yourself that it's time to get to know the pain, make friends with the pain, not so you can live with pain forever, but so you can really understand how far the pain goes, and how far the mind goes, and where the two are actually separate. Be sure that your purpose is to get to know the pain, not so much to make it go away, but to thoroughly understand it. The understanding is what will enable you to get beyond it in ways you didn't expect. The mind can be with the pain and yet not be pained by it. This is an important skill to develop because as long as there's a body, there's going to be pain. The question is not how to run away from it, but how to live with it so as not to be pained by it. Realize that the pain is simply happening, not necessarily happening to you. It's just happening. It's an event. It has no intention to harm you at all. You feel pained by it because you put yourself in the way by laying claim to the part of the body where the pain seems to be. It's like getting into the line of fire. You're bound to get shot. So don't get into the line of fire. Don't lay any claim to it. See that the pain is just something that's there, and that it's going to come, and it's going to go in line with its own causes and effects. Your only duty is to watch it, to see what it's really like for there to be pain. Simply be there with the pure sensation in the moment. How does it move around? How does it change? Exactly what about it is painful? What's the mind doing to the pain when the mind labels it? What effect does that have? If you can catch that event in the mind saying, this is this, and that is that, this is the pain, and it's doing this and all of the other running commentary that the mind makes on the present moment, then you begin to realize this in itself is a lot of the problem right there. The fear that the pain is going to stay, the anticipation that it's going to stay, all these thoughts. Just let them drop away. See what happens. Where does the pain go when they drop away? By watching this, your whole attitude toward the pain changes, because you come to see that it isn't at all what you thought it was. And at the same time you learn an awful lot about your mind, all the things that the mind comes in and says about the pain. It's as if you have a whole committee offering their suggestions and opinions. So this is a very good way of getting to know the mind, because a lot of things buried in the mind will tend to surface and focus on what's happening when there's pain. Instead of trying to run away from the pain, you just sit with it and see what kind of reaction comes up in the mind. Again, don't identify with the reactions. The reactions will say, stop, stop, stop. Or they'll say, this is this and that's that and you should do this and you should do that. Just respond, no, I'm just going to be here. I'm just going to watch. And watch both the pain and the mind's reactions to the pain. This is how you really get to know the mind while training it to become more and more dependable. If the mind isn't shaken by pain, there's very little that's going to shake it. If it doesn't fear pain, there's very little for it to fear. And when it's not afraid in the face of pain, it becomes a mind you can depend on. When you want it to work, it will work for you. When you want it to rest, it will rest. When you want it to think, it can think and it will think clearly. When the time comes for it to stop thinking, it will stop. We've spent so much of our lives developing fear of pain, fear of suffering. If you can get past that fear, get past the mind's tendency to be pushed around by these things, you've got a mind you can rely on. As when they train soldiers, they have to put the soldiers through all kinds of hell in order to know which ones they can depend on and which ones they can't. The ones who come through it okay, those are the ones you know you can depend on. It's the same with the mind. If you're afraid to face up to pain, the mind will never have any control over itself at all. It will never become something you really can depend on. It will always flinch under the pain, unwilling to do this, unwilling to do that, because it's afraid. And when that's what your mind is like, where are you going to find anything to depend on? Where are your true friends at that point? Even your own mind isn't a friend. So when the mind has settled down and really feels at home in the present moment, working with pain is an excellent way of training it. Through this you can come to see that the mind will obey you not only when you make it comfortable, but also when you test it, when you give it work to do. That's when you have a mind you can really take as your refuge. The components of suffering. May 2003. Let your mind settle in. Stay with the breath. There's nowhere else you have to go, nothing else you have to do right now. Just be with your breathing. When the breath comes in, you know it's coming in. When the breath goes out, you know it's going out. Allow it to come in and go out in a way that feels good and refreshing. If you're feeling tired, you may want to breathe in a way that's energizing. If you're feeling frenetic, breathe in a way that's more calming. Gain a sense of what the breath can do for the body and the mind here in the present moment. Do what you can to put the mind in a good mood. In other words, if you approach the process of meditation with a lot of anxiety, with a lot of frustration, that anxiety and frustration will show up in the breath and simply make things worse. So remind yourself, not too much is demanded of you right now, just being with the breath. If you notice you've wandered off, just bring the mind right back. If it wanders off again, bring it back again and try to make the breath even more comfortable. As you keep at this, you find that the mind develops a stronger and stronger foundation, a place where it can stay, a place where it really feels safe, where it feels at home, where it can look at the larger issues in life and not mess them up. The Buddha talks about suffering as his number one truth. And when we hear about that, many of us want to run away. We feel that we have enough suffering in life, we don't want to hear about it anymore. But the Buddha's whole reason for teaching about suffering is because he has a cure. To work that cure, though, you first have to get the mind in good shape, because most of us, when we deal with suffering, simply make the issue worse. We feel threatened by it, we feel surrounded by it, we start getting desperate. And in our desperation we do all kinds of things that are harmful, both to ourselves and to people around us. So first get the mind in a good mood. All you need is the breath coming in and out with a sense of well-being. If you're really observant and become familiar with the breath over time, you find that that sense of well-being starts permeating throughout other parts of your life as well. And when you've got a sense of well-being you can depend on, then you can turn to the issue of suffering to see exactly what suffering is, looking at it not so much out of desperation as out of curiosity. As the Buddha said, the best way to deal with suffering is to comprehend it, as in the passage we chanted just now. He said most people don't discern suffering. We suffer, we feel it, but we don't discern it, we don't understand it. The Buddha said that if you understand it, you can manage it. You can put an end to it. If you don't understand it, you just keep on suffering and never put an end to it at all. In his first sermon he describes suffering. The suffering of birth, the suffering of aging, the suffering of illness, the suffering of death, of being separated from what you love, of being conjoined with things you don't like, of not getting what you want. That seems to be a pretty good summation, but then he boils it down to even more basic terms. This is where the discussion gets technical. He analyzes suffering down to 5 heaps, 5 clinging aggregates. Form imbued with, Clinging, feeling imbued with clinging, perceptions, thought fabrications, and consciousness, all imbued with clinging. The clinging is the important element. It's what turns ordinary form, feeling, and so forth, into suffering. We're often told that these aggregates are the Buddha's description of what we are, but that wasn't his purpose in formulating this teaching. His purpose was to give us tools for breaking suffering down into manageable pieces. For most of us, suffering is an enormous issue, much larger and more pressing than the abstract question of who or what we are. When suffering comes, it overwhelms us. We can't stand up under its weight. In fact, that's one of the traditional definitions of suffering. That which is hard to bear. And it's hard to bear because we feel overwhelmed. When it hits hard, it seems like an enormous mountain filling our awareness. We can't get a handle on it. The purpose of dividing it into these 5 heaps is to break the mountain down into gravel, and the gravel down into dust. This helps us realize that no matter what the type of suffering, whether it's the suffering of aging, illness, death, the suffering of separation, the suffering of not getting what we want, it can all be analyzed into just 5 sorts of things. That's all it is. And furthermore, we can look at these 5 sorts of things and see that there's nothing there worth suffering over. We build enormous narratives around our pains, but what are those narratives? They're just perceptions combined with the thought fabrications built out of them. If we cling to those narratives, they're going to make us suffer. But if we take them apart, we see that there's nothing much there. So the Buddha has us focus, not so much on the storyline, but on the building blocks we use to put the storyline together. If you get down to the building blocks, you begin to see how artificial this whole process is, because these aggregates are not things. They're actually activities, things we do. We suffer because we cling to certain activities, certain movements of the mind. So to cut through this clinging, you have to keep breaking your suffering down and analyzing it. What's going on here? Suppose there's a pain in your leg and you're suffering from it. What's going on there? There's the form of the body, and then there are the actual feelings of pain. And then there are the perceptions, the labels you put on the feeling, the thought fabrications, the stories you build around the feeling, and then the consciousness, the repeated acts of being conscious of all these things. So instead of building up the stories around the feeling, getting angry about the feeling, getting upset about it, worrying about it if the mind is calm enough, you can start taking the suffering surrounding the feeling apart. What's going on? What's actually there? There's the form of the body, which is actually separate from the feeling, although we often glom the two together. If there's a pain in our knee, it feels like our whole knee is nothing but pain. But if you look at it carefully, there's the form of your body, and then there are the feelings flickering around the form. They're not a single, solid thing. Many times we perceive the feeling to be a solid thing, but now we're taking that perception apart. Actually, there's not just one perception. There are many repeated perceptions, just as there are many moments of feeling. This is why these things are called khandhas, or heaps. Like heaps of gravel or heaps of sand, they're made out of small individual events, small individual motions, either physical motions or mental motions. So you break them down. And once they're broken down, they're not too big to handle. You can change them. For example, those perceptions you apply to the feelings. What happens if you change them from perceptions of pain to simply perceptions of sensation? Or you can try to analyze the sensation into its physical aspects. The sensation of warmth or heat, or maybe a sense of blockage that feels solid. If you actually take those solid feelings apart, though, you begin to see they're not so solid after all. Then there are the stories you build up around the sensations, the fears of what will happen if you don't do something about the pain. If you sit here for the next hour, is your leg going to fall off? Will you harm the tissues of the body by cutting off the blood? The mind can build up all sorts of stories about the sensations, but instead of looking at the stories and getting caught up in the storyline, just look at them as words coming through the mind without your having to believe them. Simply watch the stories as individual words. Then you begin to see that if you cling to the storyline, You make the pain worse. So why cling to it? You don't have to follow the storyline. It's not a movie you've paid to see. You're not missing anything important if you don't follow it through to the end. So what you want to do is take the suffering apart into its component parts and locate the clinging that turns those component parts into the suffering. If you take each component part on its own, it's not all that bad. The aggregate itself is not suffering. There can be a pain in the leg, but we suffer simply because we identify with it, we lay claim to it as ours. That's why we suffer. Without the act of identification, without the clinging, there would be no suffering. The mental label that says mine or my pain, my leg or whatever. What happens if you drop it? You don't have to think it. There's nobody forcing you to think it. There's simply the force of habit. And habits can be changed. As you take the suffering apart into little bits and pieces like this, it's a lot more manageable. Many times the pain may still be there, but there's no suffering. Or sometimes when you're not worked up about it, the pain actually goes away. Some physical pains are physical in their causes, others are more mental in theirs. Even physical pain has its mental component, as the mind chooses which sensations to focus on, and which ones to ignore, which ones to downplay, and which ones to magnify with its stories and running commentary. You can see this mental component clearly when you stop the commentary, or when you just step back and watch the commentary as you would something curious, and say, well, why would I believe that? And suddenly the suffering goes away. Whether or not the pain is still there, the suffering is gone. That's when you see that the issue was not the pain, but the unnecessary suffering you created by clinging to these feelings and perceptions. When you see clearly the things you've been clinging to, and that they're not really worth clinging to, the suffering breaks down. The mountain is leveled and pulverized into dust. When you've mastered this skill, that's the end of suffering. This is the end of this episode. We will seeing you on the next episode. In harmony with the Buddha's guidance, we underscore the immense value of disseminating wisdom on a grand scale. Presently, we've converted this extensive 1,000-page tome into an easily accessible audio format. The time has come for you to contribute to this noble mission. Your participation, through subscribing, liking, and sharing this content, holds substantial significance in proliferating these teachings for the benefit of all. Together, let's carry forward the time-honored tradition of spreading knowledge and mindfulness, fostering the betterment of humanity. Your involvement in this shared endeavor has the potential to make a profound impact on the lives of countless individuals.